let's get started. So in this video, we're going to be recreating the Van Halen jump synthesizer sound using the Dave Smith Instruments sequential Prophet Rev2 synthesizer. So this sound, the jump sound, is really one of the most iconic synthesizer sounds in the history of synths. It's one of those sounds that generations of people instantly recognize the song once you hear those first few chords. And I realize this sound has been recreated on probably every synthesizer since the 1980s, but we're going to take it a step further than most recreations and really get into some advanced modulation techniques with the Prophet Rev2 synthesizer and really be discussing not just the jump sound, but how to create a virtual classic synthesizer sound within the parameters of the Prophet Rev2. So the Prophet Rev2 has a very advanced modulation matrix and a very flexible gated sequencer that is going to allow us to basically virtually create a classic synthesizer within the Rev2. All right, so let's jump in here and get started with the sound design. Okay, so far I just have a sawtooth here. This is just an initialized patch. I'm using the Prophet Rev2 editor by Sound Tower, and my Prophet is up in the rack over here. Okay, so for this type of brass sound, you generally want either a couple sawtooths or like a combination of sawtooth and square. So we got the sawtooth here. I'm going to add a square wave in here. So right now it's just a pulse because we have shape mod at 0. And now let's mix these two together so we have the saw and the square together. Okay, so that should be a good basis for a brass type of sound. All right, now let's jump over here to the amplifier and low pass filter sections and just start blocking out what we need for the envelopes here. So for the amplifier, we want a fairly quick attack, very quick attack actually, for this type of stab sound. I'm going to pull the decay up here and sort of shape this sound for a stab with a little bit of fall off and a fairly quick release. Let's see what that sounds like. All right, yeah, that's pretty close already for the amplifier envelope. For the low-pass filter, we want the filter to be mostly just controlled by an envelope. So I'm going to pull the cutoff way down, keep the key amount pretty low here. And again, we want a really quick attack. Also, I want this on two-pull mode, so I'm going to switch this to a two-pull filter. So really quick attack. For right now, I'm going to just pull the sustain all the way up, so it'll have a really quick attack and will just be held sustained. I may come back later and add some decay and pull the sustain down. And then I'm just going to pull the release up here. And let's see here. Okay, now we'll start pulling up the envelope amount. Add some velocity sensitivity too. Okay, that seems pretty good for blocking. We can always come back here later and make adjustments to these and fine-tune this a bit more. So at this point, we have a basic sound for the Van Halen jump sound. So that's about as far as some synthesizers would go in recreating this, maybe adding some pulse modulation. But we're going to jump in and start doing some advanced modulation now. So the first thing we're going to just briefly discuss, and I'm not going to go into this in detail. I explained this a little bit in a previous video for the Blade Runner patch that I did. But I wrote this article on voice component modeling. I basically set out a few months back to try to understand what it is about old classic synthesizers that give them the sound that they have and the character that they have. Old classic synths are commonly referred to as having a warmer or richer or lusher, more organic type of sound than modern DCO-based synthesizers or digital synthesizers. And so I set out to just try to figure out what objectively are the main differences. And the biggest thing that I've come across that I think makes the biggest difference that we can tackle is giving voice-by-voice imperfections to our modern synthesizer models. So this article is up at voicecomponentmodeling.com. You can read more about it here, but I go into a lot of detail in this article about voice modeling, what it is, why it's important. The basics of it are that for every one of these classic synthesizers, like a Jupiter or a Memory Moog or a CS80 or OBX or whichever one, you have a certain amount of voices, of polyphony, and each one of the voices is built out of all these electronic components, and each one of these electronic components have unique offsets. So you get, on a per voice basis, there's offsets to oscillator tuning per voice, to the attack speed and decay speed of envelopes, and really of various other characteristics. So what we want to do in order to more accurately recreate the sound of like this Oberheim OBXA. So let me open this back up. So one of the things I was able to do also in the past couple months is I was able to get a bunch of recordings. I went out to a local repair and rental shop and got recordings from a bunch of classic synths like the OBX, OBXA, CS80, Roland Jupiter models, Prophet 5, Prophet 10, Korg Poly 6, Oberheim SEM. What I did is I went through voice by voice over multiple octaves and took samples of each of the oscillators. And what I did is I mapped them out in tables like this to try to understand how voice variance affects the sound of different synthesizers. So we don't have to watch this. It's just my little tests. But basically, if you were to play an OBXA, you're never going to have a situation where when you hit a note, that it's going to be actually in tune to what that note should be. It's never going to be perfectly in tune. It's always going to have offsets of a certain amount of cents. So this table here is my actual readouts on the latest test of the latest OBXA that I tested of all 8 voices mapped out over 3 octaves and what the offsets are per voice for the oscillators. And I did it for both oscillators for each synthesizer. So what you see here is that there's this intonation offset thing happening where as you go up the keyboard, the synthesizer gets more flat, and as you go down the keyboard, it's becoming more sharp. And there's about an 11-cent difference here, ranging between 5 cents and 11 cents, depending on the voice. And they have different offsets for each of them. So basically, if you ever hit a chord on a classic synthesizer like the OBXA or any other classic synth from the 80s, you're going to have a whole bunch of variance in oscillator tuning. And what it does is it creates this natural phasing and detuning motion that creates a more warm and rich sound rather than having every note be perfectly in key and every note be perfectly in tune. Okay, so let's jump in here and start doing some voice modeling. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up the gated sequencer here. I just clicked gated sequencer and open up the editing menu. And what we have here is 4 lanes of data. So 1, 2, 3, 4 lanes. And we can use these 4 lanes of data to build a virtual model of an OBXA synthesizer. So what we're going to do here is we're going to set a reset on each one of these lanes. So what I'm doing, so I'm setting a reset at step number 9. So we want to model a 8-voice polysynth, the OBXA. So I'm creating 8 steps here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then a reset back to the beginning. And what I'm going to do is set this to key stepping mode. And now every time I hit a key, it's going to take a value from one of these steps and then advance to the next step. So we're we're basically building a virtual voice allocation table here. And now we can use these lanes to do voice modeling. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the first two lanes to model oscillator 1 frequency and oscillator 2 frequency. And I'm not going to actually map them directly this way like you might expect, just because the values are too coarse if you directly map them. But we'll be doing a trick in the modulation matrix to scale down this data. So for right now, I'm just going to set these all to around 70 something, just to show how this works. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use these values now, and I'm going to create a intonation offset table like I have here, where each of the different voices is going to progressively become more sharp, or actually more flat, and they're all going to have variations per voice. Okay, so let's jump over to the modulation matrix here. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a bunch of modulation slots to accomplish this. So the first one I'm going to set sequence track 1 and sequence track 2. And these ones down here I'm going to set to note number. So the note number modulator is really the key to creating intonation offsets. So the note number modulation allows you to get different values from the bottom of the keyboard up to the top. So lower values at the bottom of the keyboard, higher values at the top. And what we're going to do is we're going to route note number to oscillator 1 frequency and note number to oscillator 2 frequency in these two slots. And then I'm going to take the sequence 1 that we have in the gated sequencer and route this down to mod amount 5. So sequence 1 is going to come down and control the amount of this modulation, and sequence 2 is going to come down and control the amount of this modulation here. And what I'm going to do is just set these both to -1 so that it'll progressively become more flat as we go up the keyboard, like I took in these actual samples from an OBXA synthesizer. Okay, so let's play around with this for a second. Okay, so this is a low A note. Let me get my tuner up here. Okay, here we go. Let's back up. All right, so now you see every time I hit an A note here, we're coming up about 10 to 11 cents flat. Now I'm going to come up here 3 octaves higher and hit an A note. So now we're about 18 to 19 cents flat. So what we've done now is we've created an intonation offset where all 8 of our virtual voices now become more flat as you go up the keyboard, just like in the real OBXA model that I tested this on. So from the bottom of the keyboard here, from the lowest C, got about a -9 cents up to -22 cents or so. So we've got a total range there of about 13 cents, which that's about realistic for the 2 OBXAs that I tested. So what we're going to do now is make it so I don't want the whole keyboard to be flat. What I want to do is I want to set it so the middle of the keyboard, somewhere around here, is basically in tune. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull up the fine tuning on these. Okay, so somewhere around there. So this fine-tuning offset, making these sharp here, is just going to counterbalance that intonation offset that I set and make it so the middle of the keyboard is basically in tune. Now at the bottom, we're a little bit sharp down there, and at the very top, we're a little bit flat. So this is very realistic on how the 2 OBXAs that I tested performed. So now what we're going to do is we're going to vary this so it's not the same for each voice. So I'm going to make some alterations to each one of these. And this is oscillator 1, just to remember, and this is oscillator 2. And so this is just going to vary the amount of the intonation offsets. And I'm going to make changes to both of these. And I'm just doing this in a somewhat random fashion, although I've done this before. So I want to have some offsets, so there will be some detuning motion between the two oscillators per voice, and then each one also is going to have just variation when there's multiple notes hit, so the chords will have a lot of natural motion. Okay, so let's check out and see what this sounds like now. All right, so if you can hear that, now we have a lot of organic, natural detuning motion going on, where every time I'm hitting a note, not only is the voice for that note have variance in it, but each oscillator within that voice has its own offsets. So we've created a ton of natural detuning motion here that you would have if you actually were to sit down and play an OBXA or basically any other synthesizer like this. Every classic synth that I tested has this sort of behavior in it. All right, so that sounds good for oscillator offsets. We've got that sort of intonation tuning offset per voice. Now we're going to use the third and fourth lanes in this gated sequencer to model additional voice-specific characteristics. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set these to all attack and all decay. And these ones are two of the other aspects that I found to be the most important for giving variation to really nail that classic synth type of sound. And in this case, I'm not worrying about scaling down the data. So the reason why I didn't set this to oscillator 1 and oscillator 2 is that I need to scale this data down much smaller than the coarse values you get directly out of the gated sequencer. In terms of the attack and decay speed numbers, I don't need to scale them, so I'll just directly route them right here and save myself some mod slots. So what I'm going to do here is just sort of randomly create a little bit of offsets on a per voice basis here to the attack speed and decay speed. So now, in addition to the oscillator fine-tuning per voice offsets, now every time I hit a note, it will be assigned its own virtual voice, and they'll have slight variations in the attack speed of the envelopes and the decay time of the envelopes, just giving more of that organic type of feel. All right, that's sounding pretty good now. So I'm pretty happy with that. This is getting a lot of that sort of voice-by-voice characteristics that we wanted to model here from the OBXA. So we've got the intonation and oscillator tuning per voice done. We've got the envelope variance per voice done. So at this point, let's jump into a couple more of the general parameters. So one of the things we want here is we want some pulse width modulation on this square wave. So we want that sort of motion going on. So I'm going to jump over to the LFO section here and make some pulse width modulation. So I'll just grab one of these LFOs and route it to oscillator 2 shape, which is the square wave. And I'm going to pull the frequency way down here so it's not so ridiculously fast, and just pull up the amount here. Let's see what this sounds like. Okay, so this is something that you will usually do is, so when you have a large amount of shape modulation, of pulse width modulation on the bass, you often get flubby bass like that. So I basically always do this when I'm doing pulse width modulation, but I'm going to pull down this amount and instead use a note number modulator to control the amount for this pulse width modulation. So I want to route this note number modulator to LFO3 amount, which this is 1, 2, 3. So I have a note number modulator going to LFO3 amount, and I'm just going to bring this amount up here to control the actual amount of the pulse width modulation. And the way this works is the shorthand for remembering note number modulation values is that whatever number you put in here, about a quarter of that number is going to be applied at the bottom of the keyboard in standard octave range, and about 3/4 of this number, 60, is going to be applied at the top of the keyboard in standard octave range. So I'm going to get about 15 down at the bottom of the keyboard and about 45 up at the top. So let's listen to this now. Okay, so that's much better. Now we don't have that flubby bass thing going on. Okay, that sounded pretty good with the pulse width modulation. At this point, let's go ahead and make this into a stereo patch. All right, so one way you can create a stereo patch is to use the pan spread amounts, which will alternate. Each other voice goes left and right depending on the amount. But what I like to do in this case is I'm going to copy this entire layer A and paste it into layer B. So we have an exact copy on the second layer. So one of the most powerful aspects of the Prophet Rev2 synthesizer is the fact that it's bitimbral. It's got basically two identical sound engines that you can split two totally separate sounds on the keyboard with a split point and play, a bass part and a lead, up top, or you can stack them. And in the stack mode, you can do all kinds of stuff. You can either use two completely different sounds and stack them to create a really unique timbre, the combined timp sound, or you can stack them to create huge stereo spreads like what we're going to do right now. And there's actually some other creative uses for this too. But here what we're going to do is, so I stacked these two layers together, these identical layers. I've set the PN mode to fixed on both of these. And I'm going to go over to the mod matrix here and use another slot here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to route a DC, or direct current, which is just a way to directly inject the number into the mod matrix, to the pan amount. And a value of -32 is going to mean hard panned left. And I'll do the same down here on this layer. And I'll just set this one to +32, so it'll be hard panned right. So now we've got a stereo stack of this sound. All right, that sounded very much like the jump type of sound. So actually, I think there's one more characteristic I want to tackle too on a voice-by-voice basis. So this is another aspect that's almost all classic synthesizers from the early 80s and mid 80s, these classic polysynths, have some oscillator frequency settle per voice. What the frequency settle is at the very beginning when you hit a key, the oscillators sometimes don't go directly to their target pitch or their settle pitch, but what they'll do is they'll jump sharp real quick and then settle down, or jump or go flat and then rise up very quickly. And so what we'll do to model this sort of oscillator settle is I'm going to come in here to the auxiliary envelope, and I'm going to map this. So we can map it either to all frequency, or in this case, I think I'm just going to map it to oscillator 1 frequency, which is the sawtooth. The square wave already has some pulse width modulation going on. So I think I'll just map these to oscillator 1 frequency on both layers. And for this, I want to have a really quick attack. So it's going to jump up real quick and then fall back down. Somewhere around 25, 26, 27. These can be offset a little to create some variation. And what we're going to do here is pull up the envelope amount. And what I'll do to start is I'll pull it up. I'll pull it up a whole bunch just so you can hear what it sounds like. So it gives that sort of quack type of sound at the beginning, where it's quickly jumping sharp and then settling back into its target frequency. So rather than doing this, first of all, that amount is too much. I would probably dial it down, somewhere in this range. Something like that. But rather than hard coding it here, I want to make this happen on a per voice basis as well. So we'll use the modulation matrix again and the gated sequencer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to reuse one of these lanes to model this. And I think I'm just going to use this sequence 2 lane, and just because it has some good variation in it here. Actually, no, this one even has more. I'll use sequence 1 on both of these. So I'm going to go into the mod matrix here and just create another version of sequence track 1. And this is going to go to envelope 3 amount, which is that Oscillator Settle envelope. And I'm going to pull this up somewhere around here. So this value is not the actual value that's going to pass on to that settle envelope. It's going to be scaled down in the gated sequencer, and the way that that's calculated is it'll be whatever's in this in the voice value. So 76 divided by 125. So it's going to be a fractional amount, in this case 0.6 or so, something like that. So these values are going to be scaled down by whatever that ratio is on a per voice basis. So I'm going to do the same here. Sequence track 1 to envelope 3 amount. Bring this one up as well. So now we have on a per voice basis, we have this this settle envelope will vary on a per voice basis, so it won't be the same for each oscillator. Let's see. Okay. And also, I just realized too, we didn't really go in on the layer B after I duplicated this. I'm going to do some variations to the layer B values here and just muck these around a little bit so that layer B is going to have its own unique intonation offsets, just to create even more organic motion. All right, and I'll do the same with the envelopes on layer B. So we just want to really create a unique organic feeling. All right, there we go. Okay, so next let's jump into the effects section here, and one of the key aspects of the sound too, I think, is to have it sort of drenched in reverb. And we want a nice long reverb time here. And let's, probably not that much though. Let's pull this down somewhere around there. And it sounds like I need to pull the tone down here. It's a little too brittle. Let's see. Yeah, that sounds pretty good. Nice. Yeah, that's sounding very much like the jump sound now. So we're starting to get a really organic feel with all of this voice modeled behavior. We're getting that real Oberheim OBXA type of sound. I think at this point, let's jump in and add some performance modulation so we can get some vibrato as we press down on the keys. So for vibrato, I'm going to set one of these LFOs up to oscillator all frequency on both layers. And for vibrato amounts, generally do something between 60 and 80. Let's go like 72-ish on this, and route the pressure to that LFO. LFO1 and LFO1. And just bring these up to maybe around 8 or so. so similar to with the pulse width modulation, this is something I'll usually do is instead of routing the pressure directly to the vibrato LFO, I'll use a note number modulator instead and route the note number modulator to the vibrato, which is LFO 1 amount. And I'm just going to keep this at value 0 and just use this as an in-between to scale the data here. So for the pressure, now I'm going to route pressure to this mod slot, which is mod slot 4. So pressure to mod slot 4. And I can bring this up now a little bit, I think. And I'll do the same thing down here on this other layer to keep them in sync. So we're going to go LFO 1 amount here, leave it at 0, and bring this over to mod amount 4 and up. Let's check that out. Okay, that's good. So now in the bass, when I'm pressing in on the keys, the bass stays crisp and clear and doesn't get all flubby. Cool. Yeah, that sounds pretty good. I think that pretty much nails the jump sort of tone and really gets into some of the more in-depth characteristics of voice modeling and creating a sort of virtual Oberheim OBXA within the Prophet Rev2 using the gated sequencer and the modulation matrix. So I think I'll wrap up this video at this point. I'll go ahead and probably just make some more minor adjustments to this patch, and I'll make this patch available. I'll save it, and if anyone's interested in getting this patch, send me an email at jason@jasoncooper.com or comment below. And yeah, if you're interested in more tutorials like this on the Prophet Rev2 synthesizer or other synthesizers, go ahead and subscribe to this channel and mark the little bell below. All right, I think that'll do it for now. Have a good one. Bye.